HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents Alaric the Goth, An Outsider's History of the Fall of Rome, by Douglas Boin, read by Chris Macdonnell. Preface. A talented immigrant is denied citizenship by an unjust empire, and in retaliation unleashes a surprise attack on one of its beloved cultural capitals, Rome. His journey from ambitious boy to disillusioned adult takes 4 decades, but by the time he dies in the 5th century AD, he will be remembered as the foreigner who forced the most powerful politicians of his day to think twice about who they called a barbarian. He changed history, and yet his version of it has never been told. His name was Alaric, and this is his story. Born at the river that divided 2 lands, he survived a border policy that separated immigrant children from their families, saw lightning success as a soldier, and became the widely respected leader of his people, the Goths. He also watched as his dream of achieving the basic dignity of citizenship slipped away during a time of political paralysis, a frustration that turned him into a champion for his people and an enemy of the Roman Empire. Time has not looked kindly on what he and the Goths wrought. From the medieval period to today, each new trend that departed in some way from society's norms has been stigmatized with the Gothic name. Haunting architecture, disturbing horror stories, and an intimidating black-letter typeface acquired the adjective from hostile critics. A reclusive post-punk sound celebrates its moodiness, as does a modern subculture that embraces the dark, gloomy, and macabre. If being called Roman has always been considered traditional or classic, to be Gothic is different and usually a bit barbaric. As a historian, I've always been fascinated by the origins of stereotypes and gross generalizations. The use of derogatory words and insensitive imagery excludes many people from the full life of a community, relegating their stories to the margins of their time and erasing them from later generations. There's something deeply unsettling in watching how the reputation of an entire group can be so effortlessly, insidiously caricatured, and I've long suspected that the Goths' name was distorted in similar ways. Contrary to what the Romans believed, the Goths did succeed in making lasting contributions to world history. They established legal customs that shaped the histories of modern Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy. In their fight for human decency, they torched the bigotry that lay at the heart of antiquated notions of citizenship, and in an eerily prescient way they championed the values of religious tolerance when many Christians at the time pursued heretics, imposed draconian moral laws on society, and outlawed the freedom of religious expression. The public record of Alaric's life is frustratingly thin. Whole decades of his existence have simply vanished, and what little we do know about him comes to us second hand. But for the past 4 years I gathered every scrap of evidence that could tell me about him or his family, every artifact that could bring me closer to his time, from manuscripts brushed with sparkling ink to butchered rabbit bones, the leftovers from a Gothic dinner. Much of what survives comes from the lives of people who likely never expected to find themselves in the pages of a history book. An elderly widow who lived alone in her mansion, a little girl sold into slavery, a farmer's son who rose briefly to emperor. Sometimes these individuals are known only by a single name: Marcella, Passia, Maximinus. They may not seem like natural or helpful starting points for investigating Alaric's life, but we can learn a lot from their experiences. We can reconstruct the story of how Alaric's family settled at the frontier, and with the aid of archaeology, see how a Gothic boy spent his days at the border. We can say when young Alaric enlisted in the army and why. We can even recount in remarkable detail the political intrigue of 4th century Rome. From this collection of odds and ends, we steal a glimpse of a real person, From the rich context of the time emerges an impression of Alaric and, with it, a world we thought we knew, but never imagined from his perspective. Alaric and his people were not the only ones living on the Roman Empire's margins during the 4th and 5th centuries. Some of these other foreigners are infamous and still frightening. The Vandals, on their march from northern Europe to their new home in North Africa, left a trail of destruction synonymous with their name. Other groups sound familiar because of their leaders. Attila, from the steppes of Central Asia, is probably the most recognizable of the people known as the Huns. But it was the Goths, led by Alaric, who masterminded the most devastating assault against the city of Rome in its more than 1,000-year existence. Their story intrigued me the most. For centuries, the Goths in the Danube Valley reaped the benefit of close contact with their neighbours. Yet Rome's border had always been a contested place, one where open hostility flared and xenophobia festered. Alaric himself hailed from beyond the Danube River in what constituted one of the northeastern frontiers of the Roman Empire. Although the people from this area are often called Visigoths as a way to distinguish them from the Ostrogoths who came to rule Italy, no such division existed in Alaric's time. That distinction was invented later. Even the backstory to Alaric's title, king, is more complicated. The word was the cry of his adoring fans, not a formal proclamation that came with sceptre and throne. Alaric himself chose at a young age to enlist in the army, perhaps to further his career. He succeeded marvellously. Becoming a trusted soldier who served on the battlefield with a revolutionary emperor, he bridged 2 worlds and spoke 2 languages, that of his fellow soldiers and the language of power, Rome's. These tools and talents helped him move up the ranks, tantalizing him with the hope of a lucrative government salary in the growing center of politics and diplomacy, the eastern capital of Constantinople. Alaric's view of his adopted land soured at the end of the 4th century as rampant bigotry in Roman cities, combined with a lackluster commitment on the emperor's part to reward the Goths for their service, radicalized him. By the turn of the 5th century, he had convinced his followers to exact revenge. The anatomy of his plot to attack Rome unfolds against the backdrop of some of the most significant events in world history: the rise of Christianity, the growth of the Persian Empire, and the crumbling of a once united Mediterranean. There's a darker history here too, as fanatical Christians stoked the flames of civil war and turned the Roman Empire into one of history's first Christian states. In the wake of their triumph, they interrupted Alaric's 3-day siege as a sign of the end of days, and with the help of Scripture, transformed 72 Hours in Rome into a narrative of a disaster of biblical proportions. Within decades, they had weaponized fear of another catastrophe, of foreigners, to resist their rapidly changing world, while the only political order they ever knew tilted away from Rome and toward new global horizons. This period was no savage dark age of urban collapse, nor was it a comforting age of spirituality, a time of fevered conversion when people flocked to the church. Pervasive bigotry, state-supported Christian violence, and irrational xenophobia were the coin of the realm during Rome's later years. Those, in fact, were the shocking values awaiting Alaric and the Goths when they made first contact with the empire. This was an age of extremism, a time when moderates everywhere lost political ground and radical beliefs about religious identity, state borders, and cultural exchange polluted the air, spreading unchecked across 3 continents. The political, cultural, and social disintegration of the Roman Empire might have been shocking, but not wholly surprising to those of Alaric's age. Their generation had witnessed dysfunction and disunity their entire lives, and one of the most divisive issues was the question of citizenship and whether foreigners would have a fair shot at becoming Romans. It's time to think deeply and differently about the lives of marginalized people too often invisible in our history books. That's why the marquee name in this history of the later Roman Empire is not a Roman but an immigrant, a man the Romans would have understood as a refugee, a prophagus. Alaric ultimately did find his voice in a spectacular act of violence, but when told from his point of view, Rome's fall appears less scary than it usually sounds. This Gothic tale is a hard lesson in the realities of growing up. Chapter 1. 72 Hours. Whoever attacks one city attacks them all. Libanius of Antioch. August the 24th began as an ordinary day in the Eternal City. As the month-long summer holiday of races and festivals neared its end, market stalls reopened. Proprietors disassembled their storefront slats, and there was a welcome return to routine. Long ago the Romans had honored this month with the eternal name of their first emperor, Augustus. This current August the 24th fell in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Honorius, the 42nd man to hold the title. Much later, a Christian monk would propose a less pagan way of counting time, inspired by Jesus' birth, and the year would be called AD 410. Marcella was at home on the night of the attack. While other Romans were enjoying their luxurious dinners, she had chosen to be surrounded by her books. A marvelously rich life was rolled up in the scrolls and sewn between the hardback covers of the volumes stacked on the shelves of Marcella's library. Now nearly 80, she had dared to think differently from an early age. While other Romans her age displayed their books as marks of status, she surrounded herself with old thinkers like Plato to satisfy her hunger for big questions, like what was good and what was just, and what happened to the soul after death. Most of the authors she favored were long dead, but curiosity drove her passion to explore. The arresting tales of a hermit who warred with demons in the Egyptian desert had inspired her to tend to her own spiritual health. Cushioned by generations of her family's wealth, married, then widowed after only 7 months, Marcella had come to see the uselessness of riches, just like St. Anthony had. She turned away suitors and never remarried. A community of Christian women came to revere her as a mentor. One of those young girls was with her the night she was abducted. The neighborhood of the Aventine Hill, where Marcella had her home, overlooked Rome's greatest stadium, the Circus Maximus. Several times a month, roars from the crowd barreled through the district's streets, lined with cypresses and umbrella pines. Businessmen and politicians came in their togas and tunics to steam and soak in the local baths. Wealthy men dined at the hill's exclusive clubs, meeting in underground banquet halls where they were initiated into the mysteries of Mithras, a pagan star god whose life story promoted an appreciation for esoteric astrology. Converts to Christianity, still a relatively young religion, gathered at houses of worship nearby. But on the night of the 24th of August, 410, whatever security had been stationed at the city's perimeter failed. The wooden doors and portcullises at the city's larger gates were supposed to be shut and locked nightly. Soldiers were under orders to secure them, with night watchmen patrolling in shifts. A resident of Rome would have been reassured by the sight of flickering torches in the alleyways, carried by the fire brigade on lookout throughout the night. But none of the systems meant to protect the city functioned that night, which Romans historians calculated as 1,164 years since the city's foundation, when intruders stormed the city through the Salt Gate, a route that had once been popular among foreigners. 1,000 years earlier, a tribe of Italians called the Sabines had followed this same road into Rome when they came to trade their cereals and crafts for salt. By Marcella's day, The Sabines counted among the many indigenous people whose names the Romans had memorized, then quickly forgotten. But everyone still knew and used the Salt Gate. The basalt paving stones of its road followed the tawny hills of Umbria into northeastern Italy, toward the Adriatic coast and beyond, where it met the craggy landscape of the Balkans, connecting the Roman Empire to the frontier. This time the Salt Road brought a far different group of foreigners into Rome, men who intended to rob and kidnap its comfortable citizens and set homes and public buildings on fire. They had timed their attack on the city with meticulous precision, their chief goal to sow as much fear and terror as they could. The quiet of Marcella's villa was a luxury very few could afford in this cosmopolitan city of perhaps 1 million people. She must have heard the commotion below the hill, loud and more brutal than the stadium games, before the assailants broke into her house, grabbed her from her bedroom, and marched her to a cold marble church outside the city walls. What happened next across the city and the empire has been described in countless books as 3 days of panic, widespread uncertainty, and high-level negotiation. Marcella died within days. The news of her tragic passing elicited a letter of condolence from the great biblical scholar Jerome of Bethlehem, who wrote to a younger friend of Marcella's to express his remorse at the sudden loss of one of the most celebrated figures in her native city of Rome. The fires sent many other Romans scrambling, which may have been the attackers' aim, to smoke out the residents of the city, shock the citizens out of their apathy, and punish them for their government's injustices. The city's fire brigade sprang into action, a force of men 8,000 strong carrying their buckets, ladders, poles, and blankets, yet unaccustomed to disasters on this scale. As the fires spread and smouldered, family members went missing from burning homes. Fortunes were lost. By dawn of the next morning, August the 25th, residents were waking up to the extent of the destruction. The invaders had not limited themselves to Marcella's tony neighborhood, the Aventine Hill. Many quarters of the city had suffered a punishing, coordinated attack. More disturbing still, the assailants were at large. For the next tense 2 days, those ruthless gatecrashers, how many of them remains unclear, held the proud city and its people hostage. 1,600 years later, Marcella's final moments seemed to bring an entire era of world history to an end. One bishop at the time used the tragedy to preach about the dangers of being surrounded by the world's savage barbarians. Jerome, in his epistolary eulogy for Marcella, lamented the stunning reversal that had knocked the Romans' soaring ambitions from the city's towering heights. Capiter urbs quae totum cepit urbum. The city that once captured the hearts and minds of the world has been captured. Just 6 short words in Latin, even in translation, his exclamation reads like a sobering newspaper headline. For some churchmen of the 5th century, this one event, the sack of Rome, pushed half of their mighty empire into its grave. For others, in the safety of the East, including nervous but vocal Christian preachers like Timothy Ilarus, the attack confirmed their suspicions about the coming of the Antichrist and the imminent end of the world. Roman citizens throughout the empire felt the shock. As wealthier Italians fled to their second homes in Africa and cargo boats sailed from the Roman harbour, the news slowly spread across Europe, Africa, and Asia, where Rome had its many territorial holdings. In the coming days and weeks, people in the farthest parts of the earth were setting aside days of public grief and mourning, said Bishop Augustine of Hippo, writing from a small city west of the great African port of Carthage. Some of Marcella's friends are known to have joined the African congregations. Few Romans would have expected such a spectacular assault. The last documented incident of foreigners invading the city had occurred nearly 800 years before, in 390 BC, when a gaggle of patriots had unexpectedly saved Rome. choosing a night when there was a faint glimmer of light, as the Roman writer Livy narrated the history of the event. A pack of hairy, bedraggled soldiers from Gaul had stormed the capital's most sacred citadel, the Capitoline Hill. Cloaked in darkness, stealthily navigating the dimly lit streets, they did not even wake the dogs, an animal peculiarly sensitive to nocturnal sounds. As the Gauls approached the hill, it seemed that nothing could stop the annihilation of the city. Nothing, that is, except the birds. At the sound of the approaching footsteps, honking geese kept on the temple grounds and sacred to the goddess Juno raised the alarm. Their noisy cries roused the Roman army, sending soldiers to their battle positions. The Capitoline birds would forever be honored as the heroes of that first and, for centuries, only foreign attack on the city. A lot had changed in those 8 centuries. The quaint Roman Republic ballooned into an empire of 60 million people. Where one imperious Caesar had previously been too many, offending the cooperative sensibilities of Rome's republican government, 2 Caesars eventually became the norm, an important source of political stability for a government that ruled on 3 continents. Rome, the city the ancient writer Plutarch said had been founded as an asylum, the Latin word translates to a sanctuary for refugees, grew into a bastion of unrivaled wealth and power. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman people were espousing the virtues of being a cosmopolitan, the idea stitched together from the Greek words for global, cosmos, and citizen, polites. As the borders of the Roman Empire expanded and incorporated many different communities, however, there remained a nagging fear of people who looked or sounded different. Foreigners were called barbarians, an epithet the Romans borrowed from the Greeks. Stereotyping was common and bias rarely questioned. People who hailed from colder climates, like the Goths, were said to be bearish because they had been born under the constellations of the Bears, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. Northerners were generally considered unfriendly because their climate was assumed to be far too cold to nurture warm personalities. Superstitious beliefs about geography warped the Romans' minds, concepts they learned from colorful poets and prose writers. Although navigational charts and maps existed to guide ancient explorers, it was the imagination of artists, not the precision of experts, that taught Greeks and Romans the contours of their world. The land of scorched earth, from which Greek authors like Homer derived the name for Ethiopia, was the farthest south many could imagine. To the distant north, a mythical population who dwelled beyond the cold wind, the Hyperboreans, were believed through the age of Alexander the Great to hem in the known world. Rome's early emperors dispatched their scouts to the east and the northwest, bringing back news of Mesopotamia and the British Isles, along with luxury goods, from pears to pearls. But 2 centuries after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, rivers largely remained the empire's most striking territorial borders. The legendary Euphrates in the east, the north-south Rhine which buffered Gaul, and the Danube across eastern Europe. Only in the 6th century AD would an explorer from the Roman world pen the first surviving account of having spied the land of China. The center of their supposedly civilized world, as it were, was the temperate land of the Mediterranean olive trees, where sophisticated citizens lived in dense metropolises. A network of roads connected these hot spots of common culture and values. People from thousands of miles away recognized one another in a city's open forums. For the people of the 4th century, the city of Rome had long been the cultural center of their world, nearly as fixed and immovable as Earth, which lay at the center of the Greeks' and Romans' concepts of the universe. One didn't have to leave this city to experience the riches of what lay beyond. Here merchant vessels arrive carrying these many commodities from every region in every season and at every time of the year. so that the city takes on the appearance of a sort of common market for the world, one ancient writer observed in the 2nd century. What one does not see here does not exist. Even in the early 5th century, visitors to Rome's markets could catch a whiff of the luxurious oils and expensive spices brought in a constant stream of cargo from Yemen, Ethiopia, and India, among them the pine anise scent of frankincense oil and the woody resin of myrrh. And the majesty of Rome's monuments still exercised a strong gravitational pull on people. Romans of every rank came to watch the sand on the floor of the Colosseum darken with the spattered blood of the exotic prey hunted in the arena for the amusement of the crowd. Many heard rumours of the emperor's dazzling domed audience hall, the colourful Pantheon. The Latin language has a small way to denote big concepts. To evoke hard-to-define intangible qualities, Romans invented a linguistic shorthand, and many of the words they composed with it are easy to recognize. The quality of freedom they called libertas, the quality of seriousness gravitas. To name the most abstract thing of all, the quality of what it meant to live under the rule of the emperors, to call one of the 100+ provinces your home, and to know that the borders of your world were protected day and night by soldiers at the frontier, they coined the word Romanitas. Romans who used this word knew they belonged to a community larger than one city, bigger than themselves. But as a concept it was nearly impossible to define. Even before the attack in 410, a buffet of customs, languages, religions, and values had been set under the umbrella of being a Roman. It included Latin speakers and Greek speakers, urbanites and rural folks, Jews, Christians, believers in the Greek and Roman gods, and atheists. Generations of Romans did the mental work of figuring out the meaning of Romanitas for themselves, and it was not uncommon to see a range of expressions as varied as the residents of Athens and Zeugma. But Romans to whom this notion appealed at least shared a vision for their society. Everyone could aspire to its united ideals, both inside the empire and beyond its borders. In reality, whether they had ever laid eyes on the rest of the globe didn't matter in order for Romans to sustain this lofty, ethnocentric self-image. The pledge of one's Romanitas came in the goods one purchased, in the principles of toleration one professed, and in one's personal ambitions. Visitors to Mediterranean cities could easily recognize these Roman values. Rome was their fullest expression. In their richly decorated bedrooms, Roman wives put on airs of wealth and gowns of lustrous imported silk to impress their friends, while in public, senators frittered away their fortunes on games for their sons, grisly hunts and cutthroat horse races, to ensure that Junior entered the public light with a recognizable name. One politico spent £2,000 of gold, almost half the annual income for Rome's wealthiest households, to celebrate his son's election. Women smelled of subtle Persian musk, their husbands of not too subtle wine. Elite families everywhere watched their investments grow in olives, grapes, and ceramics. Each of their villas looked like a medium-sized city, replete with its own temples, fountains, and baths. No other city, it was said of Rome, could ever truly call itself the home of the world's rulers. The claim was hyperbolic, but its self-centeredness was revealing. Yet try as they might, even rabid xenophobes could not isolate themselves from the reach of foreign cultures. Every day in the kitchen, at the vegetable market, and on the dining couch brought another introduction to the customs and lands of distant people. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Romans feasted on Syrian dates and Egyptian olives as their empire expanded to the eastern Mediterranean. By the 4th century, the recipe for a popular herbed cheese spread called for Persian pears, first spotted by Alexander the Great on the frontier of the Hellenistic world in Central Asia, but now picked from trees grown on Roman soil. In Marcella's time, Indian parrot, The escargot or shark's fin soup of its day was a coveted delicacy. Busy lawyers and their demanding clients ordered it in the empire's rapidly growing eastern capital, Constantinople. Wine was imported to Italy from Gaza, starting in the early days of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?